So from here, from this, Greek Empire is disintegrated. West, there's really just barbarians from the point of view of the Greeks. Okay, we don't even know what language they speak. But here, something is beginning. Okay, city is founded, Rome, and legend. You can read the legend of how it started with the Etruscans and so on. But eventually, it starts conquering the Greek colonies, then the main Phoenician city, then eventually the whole of Greece. At this point, Greece has declined a lot. This is 150 years after Alexander. It's just one of the many kingdoms left behind. But symbolically, Rome, they used to be the barbarians, conquer Athens. They used to be the most civilized place in the world, And then 63 BC, I put it here because, of course, it will come back when we talk about the Christians. They also, Rome also invades what today is Palestine. And then, very important, Rome keeps expanding, and this is the first war against Persia. We call it Persia because the Roman called it Parthia, and so Persia became the Western name, Iran today. And that's important, why? Because there will be centuries of wars between, until the Arab conquest. It was endless war. The only major empire that Rome hit was Persia. Okay, everything else was very small or not worth it. Then Julius Caesar is most famous. Up to here, he becomes dictator, he invades even more. And then you have Octavianus, more famous as Augustus. Augustus actually is just a title, it just means emperor. And becomes the first emperor. Jesus is born under Octavianus. At that point, the Roman Empire is really an empire. And from the point of view of the civilizations that were here before, they have taken most of Egypt, part of the Middle East, Greece, and this whole area. This whole area were barbarians, and now they start speaking Latin when they're under Roman occupation. This becomes the granary of Rome. Hard to believe today, but Libya and Egypt were the big agricultural producers at the time. Rome itself, big difference with Greece, is not engaged in foreign trade. And big difference with Egypt and China and so on, is not a big producer of agricultural goods. What Rome does is internal trade. It conquers, and then the trade is internal. So the granary of Rome is here, but that's part of the Roman Empire. Okay? And eventually this sea becomes all Roman and very safe. For the first time, probably for the only time, because even today it's not safe anymore. Now if you put it globally, as I said, here you have the Han, which is one of the glorious dynasties of China, and here you have the Roman Empire. And there was probably already some knowledge of each other, but that's nothing. The real Silk Road comes much later, Marco Polo times, and then you have people going back and forth. And in between, you have Persia. Rome, as you probably know, at the peak was an amazing city. It had a lot of people by those standards, and buildings that look modern because they're multi-story. That the equivalent of boulevard, avenues, stadiums and theaters and so on. Most of what the Romans knew was really Greek. Not only they conquered that part of Greece that was called Magna Graecia, but just the Greek influence was so strong all over, it's not surprising. So if you look at the gods of Rome, it's almost one-to-one with the Greeks, the Greek gods. There's some others that probably come from Etruscans and other pre-existing tribes in Italy. But the important ones, one-to-one with the Greek ones. The way that the city is designed, very similar. If you heard of the Roman Forum, well, that's the Agora. The temples, pretty much the same. The theater is only different because the Greeks had the half circle, and with the Romans, you have the Colosseum, right? Which is a circle. They had the circus instead of the stadium, but it's really the Greek city. Roman literature starts with the Greek epic and dramatic poetry. And Roman philosophy is the adoption of the Greek schools of philosophy. This is not Aristotle and Plato, this is later. We're talking about 150 years after Aristotle. So at that point, the Greek philosophy was more, hard to define, but more practical, more how to live your daily life. Cynics, Epicureans, and so on. Stoics. And Roman sculpture, if you're not an expert, sometimes it's really hard to tell if that's Roman or Greek. So the influence is obvious, but there are differences. The most important difference is knowing over doing or doing over knowing. The Romans were more practical. The Greeks were thinkers. The Romans were doers. That's, you know, if you want to really simplify it. And they never translated Aristotle in Latin. Way too theoretical for them. And in fact, one famous Roman senator wrote that sentence: "The day will come when posterity will be amazed that they will remain ignorant of things that will to them seem so plain." And in fact, that is true. The Romans actually, from the point of view of philosophy, even science, mathematics, they were not particularly bright compared with the Greeks. And not very interested in metaphysics. The Greek philosophy is, what is the universe made of? The atoms, the four elements, you know, all this speculation about the universe. What's the universe ultimately made of? And how was it created? What is change? The Romans were really not that interested. And their religion was also very pragmatic. I think you see the next slide. The Roman religion was a state religion. The ultimate purpose was not salvation of you, was salvation of the state. Was not your immortal life, was the immortal life of the Roman Empire. Throughout the empire there was the philosophy. Okay? Morality was patriotism, fighting for the empire. Big difference, the Roman gods do not quarrel. You know, the Greek gods look like they come out of a cartoon. They're fighting each other, they're mean, not the Roman gods. Roman gods are pretty serious. They are the equivalent of a business meeting with suit and tie. You know, they're more formal. They're more dignified. And they don't mingle with humans. The afterlife, again, the Romans not interested in individual immortality. Immortality comes through the state. It was the Roman Empire that had to be eternal. Rome is the eternal city. Of course, the Mediterranean Sea was very important because that's what they conquered, and that's what they felt confident with. And once they conquered the Mediterranean Sea, it was fantastic. You know, talk about free trade and safety. You know, so Rome was mainly sea power. After this battle, they owned the whole Mediterranean. There's no piracy. There's you know, friendly people all over, friendly ports. And those ports were used for merchants, soldiers, migrants, craftsmen, politicians, philosophers, eventually Jews, Christians. You know, it facilitated movement very quickly. People always wonder, how did the Christians spread so easily throughout the Roman world? It was actually very easy to travel in those days. I don't know, cheap, but definitely much easier than it is today. And you know, before the Romans, there were fortifications on the sea. With the Romans, when you go to Italy or even, you know, Libya, places that were Roman, you see villas by the sea. That's how safe it was. No need for forts. Now, the society was divided in the aristocracy, the ordinary people, the slaves, and women. Now, women, when I spoke about Greece, I said that women in Greece was not the best place for women. They were really, we don't even know much about the wives of very important people. That's just irrelevant. In the Roman world, they were more important. In fact, some of them were extremely influential. the mother of Constantine is pretty much the one who decided Christianity is okay. And they own the property, they have rights. So a little better. The slaves, very important. This was a slave economy. The Roman economy totally driven based on slaves. And the role of the aristocrats was actually interesting. Wealthier citizens are expected to sacrifice more than the common good. More, not less. So the aristocrats were the first ones to go to war and the first ones to die. Right? So the Roman Republic was really a republic of the aristocracy in terms of they owned it, but they also sacrificed everything for that thing. Okay, so it was an interesting. Imagine if our Congress people and senators were the first ones.
Yeah, right.
You know, the ideal was the aristocrat has to be modest, frugal, law-abiding. Okay, this is the republic, not the empire. Things change in the empire. This is still the Roman Republic. Is before Christ, basically. If you want to simplify it. Before.
And this is after they've kind of already dominated the post-war.
This is when they're big, but technically the term empire has not been introduced. Okay, Augustus is the one who introduced the term. And if you want, you can start the empire with Julius Caesar, because it was already technically an empire. Okay, but this is the republic before those guys centralized power in that way. The Senate was very important. The senator, more likely to die in battle than the proletariat. They are the ones who have the power. But they are the ones also, you know, first, you know, front line. Slaves, as I said, 30% of the population. They were employed everywhere. Those farmlands were huge, and it was mostly slaves that worked there, which has consequences. I don't know if I have a slide, but you know, one reason why the Romans had no motivation to industrialize, they had that technology. That technology was pretty amazing, but they never really industrialized. The reason that they had free, cheap labor. No need to use, you know, like in China, a big thing was the water wheel. They had a little industrial revolution thanks to the water wheel. The Romans didn't need it. You have slaves. They work for free. What's the point? So then you enter the empire. The empire really starts with Augustus. You know, the civil wars here and there. Then eventually it takes over, and this is just before Jesus, to give you, you know, timeline. And the empire has good things and bad things. And the good thing, of course, for 2 centuries, Rome didn't know what war is. Unless they went to war against somebody, but Rome itself didn't see a bomb, well, they didn't have bombs, didn't see an enemy attacking for 2 centuries. All the ancient civilizations were under one emperor. Egypt, Greece, part of Mesopotamia, the Phoenicians, they were all under one emperor. The network of roads, the Romans were very good at building the road and then invading the country. But the road stays. So the road then was used for all sorts of purposes. And so, free trade. Traders don't need to cross the border, same laws, same language, same coins, safety, therefore, boom, economic boom. 2 centuries of great life. Cities, Rome was, by the standards of back then, this is a huge number. Rome was a colossal city. Second biggest, still Alexandria, which is in Egypt. Greek city. They spoke Greek in Alexandria. Basically, this side spoke Latin. This was barbarians invaded by the Romans and forced to speak Latin now. This side, yeah, in official documents, Latin, but ordinary people, Greek or Aramaic, but you know, Greek more than Latin. And then other cities that today are not that big. But just to give you an idea, it's interesting that all of these cities are on this side. There's no big city on this side. No Paris, London, Madrid. West, Rome. East, Alexandria, Ephesus, Antioch. So most of those big cities are actually east. West, poor, rural, a new civilization speaks Latin. East, rich, urban, all civilizations speak Greek. That's not obvious. Most people still think, when they see this map, they tend to think, oh, this was the rich part. Just the opposite. This was the rural, poor, still not developed. That was the part that had the great temples, the great cities, and lots of money. Of course, the big thing about the Romans, borders. Okay, other civilizations built walls where it made sense. The Great Wall of China is actually a set of walls built where it makes sense to protect. For the Romans, the wall had a different meaning. This side of the wall, it's okay. If you cross that wall, I kill you. Okay, that was the border. Very strong sense of the border. That's why we know exactly the size of the Roman Empire. Okay. They were very good at dividing and then conquering their enemies. So what they eventually did, it was very similar actually to the United States and Latin America, where they didn't want to invade. At some point, they didn't want to invade anymore. It didn't make a lot of sense to invade. I mean, the border was already difficult enough to protect. But the people outside wanted to become Roman. So there's funny stories where the barbarians are actually attacking not to destroy the Roman Empire, but because they want to become part of the Roman. Come and invade us. If you don't do it, we'll make trouble. Okay? And the Romans eventually gave them different status. It was halfway between becoming part and not becoming part. But a lot of the barbarian invasions actually started for that reason, because the Romans didn't want them. The barbarians did not want to destroy the Roman Empire. In fact, they spoke Latin. They even adopted Christianity eventually. The Arabs were a different story. Now, the official religion I told you was the state religion. But there was another Jupiter, But all these Eastern religions that I mentioned, some of them coming from Egypt, and some of them coming from the Middle East, they were actually spreading at different points in times in the Roman Empire. So Christianity was not the first one. There were many other religions that came and spread to the Roman Empire. The Romans had a mixed. Generally speaking, the Roman Empire could care less which god you want to worship. The biggest Roman temple ever is the temple to Baal in Lebanon. Who's Baal? Not a Roman god, but it's the biggest temple ever built in the Roman Empire. So the Romans were okay. You want to worship your god? Fine. As long as you do not doubt there is only one empire, one emperor. Okay? The Christians made the mistake of saying there's a king of kings. The Romans' science, very bad. This is, William Durant is a famous historian, I think he's dead now, and he wrote at one point, this is the most famous scientific book of the Romans. The natural history is a lasting monument to Roman ignorance. Okay. The only guy who was important for a long time is Galen, who wrote on medicine, and Galen's medicine remained popular for 1,000 years. But that's because for 1,000 years we knew very little about the human body. Science was not for the Romans. Technology, practical technology, bricks, Roman arch, building roads, aqueducts, yes. But science, not their thing. This is their thing. Roads. Nobody else built so many roads. And you can still see them. If you go to Rome, you should definitely rent a bike and do the Via Appia. Also because the catacombs are there. It's 7 kilometers left, and you see how it was. So, engineering is the right way to put it. Roads, 70,000 kilometers, city walls, of course. This is the first place that had sewers and aqueducts, and things that we take for granted, but they were not in the ancient world. And they would not be during the Middle Ages, when Rome disappears. So not trivial. Multi-story buildings. Why? Roman arch. Before, the Roman arch buildings would collapse if you made them too big. The Roman arch, in theory, can go as far up as you like. The problem is the elevator. They didn't have the elevator. But with the Roman arch, you can go as far high as you like. See, vertical water wheel, they had it, but they used it only for grinding flour. No need to use it for industrial works because they have slave labor. No horses for agriculture. Yeah, the great rivers also not exploited. Mainly, they were borders. They were not considered as waterways. In China, waterways. Technology of the curve, arch, vault, dome. Multi-story buildings, no, I already told you. No, that's what they built. One building they built is the basilica that people associate with the early Christians, but actually it was a place to meet. And the Christian church eventually will be exactly this building. The architecture comes from what the Romans were doing. So, at that point, for 2 centuries, peace, prosperity, great cities, and everything. One thing that created a problem is that it wasn't the enemies that were causing wars, it was the emperors and fighting each other. The potential emperors fighting each other. So civil wars started escalating, and those in that century was one civil war after the other. And it would be a very thick book to write all the civil wars that happened in the Roman Empire. Another thing that happened eventually, this guy also won a civil war, and then one thing he did was the Edict of Milan, 313, and that's where the persecution of Christians ends. I put it there because next we're going to talk about the Christians. It was really his mother who defended the Christians. That doesn't mean that the Roman Empire becomes Christian. It will go back and forth. There will still be persecutions later, but at this point they stop killing them, so Christians expand very rapidly. The other thing that happens about this time is that the Roman Empire gets split in two. Why? It's just too complicated. It's become so big that Constantine decides to move the real capital to Byzantium, Constantinople. Byzantium is the Greek name, Constantinople is the name he gave to his city, and today it's called Istanbul because the Turks conquered it. The church remains in Rome. Okay, this we're going to see when I talk about Christianity. So the Roman Empire has done this amazing job of unifying different civilizations for 2 centuries, peace. Then progressively it collapses, and we can talk forever about if it was the civil wars, if it was the Christians, or if it was just, some people speculate about diseases, whatever. Anyway, at one point the barbarians invade, and the barbarians go through the Roman Empire so easily. That's always been the mystery. How could that happen? It's like suddenly out of the blue Mexicans and Nicaraguans enter the United States, invade, and settle in Seattle, in Michigan, whatever. That's literally what happened. Right? Barbarians coming from here would cross, enter, then eventually would settle in North Africa. It's puzzling, but that's what happened. So the unity of the Roman Empire is disintegrated, the Eastern Empire survives. So it's the Western Empire that collapses. The Eastern Empire survives. So different theories. One theory is that it just evolved because it looks very fragmented now, but again, all these barbarians actually, I don't know of any exception, spoke Latin, and they wanted to be federati, they wanted to be part of the Roman Empire. In fact, the guy who invaded Italy itself, he called himself Roman Emperor, not something else. So one theory is that it just evolved. Another theory, it had been falling for 2 centuries, and at the moment when the barbarians take Rome, it's just a symbolic moment, but Rome had already been decaying. One problem the Romans had, they never had succession rules, so all the civil wars started because it was not clear who was going to be the next emperor. Most of them, of course, wanted their son to be the next emperor, or their adopted son. But there was no real rule, so of course the moment you die, they're going to fight for power. But it's also interesting that the Roman Empire indirectly trained, funded, and armed the barbarian kingdoms. And that's a mistake that not only the Romans did. some of the generals, the main generals of the Roman Empire at one point came from barbarian tribes. And in fact, one was very close friend with the king of a barbarian kingdom. So you can also speculate that the motivation to fight was not that big. It's like if the United States hired a lot of Chinese in the army, and eventually there's a war between the United States and China, and then it's not clear what the loyalty is. Persian Wars is another important story. This will continue even after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Those wars were endless, and it was two major powers, so definitely consuming a lot of resources. And then it was just a very long border. Yeah, it's great to control the sea, but that means you have a border is like this, instead of having a border is like this. So anyway, lots of books have been written about the collapse of the Roman Empire. But there's a point to be made about the fact that the civilization itself did not collapse at that point, actually. Because after the invasion of the Western Roman Empire, those people still speak Latin, and those people became Christian very rapidly. They adopted the Roman code of law. They had the same coins. The unity of the Mediterranean was really broken by the Arabs. So this is about 5th century, the Arabs are 7th century. During those 2 centuries there was political chaos in theory, but it wasn't all Latin, it was the Roman law, it was Roman coins. When the Arabs come, then it's another story. Then there's really a breakdown in communication between South and North. Eventually one of these barbarian kingdoms became prevalent. And okay, I don't want to go too far ahead, but basically there were many barbarian kingdoms. One becomes very important. It's the Franks. Franks now, of course, France, but the Franks actually come from Aachen, which is in Germany. This guy was, if you have to decide between French and German, he was German. And so he establishes this kingdom, so that's all the barbarian kingdoms, this becomes the most important. Eventually the Pope recognizes him in some funny way, and that gets to be called the Holy Roman Empire. So it's an attempt to rebuild the Roman Empire in the West. It will never succeed, but that's the idea. The Eastern Roman Empire still exists, and still fighting the Persians. And we will see what happens there.